Henry VIII did not just eat himself into ruin. He devoured his own body from the inside out. His table overflowed with excess, yet his empire trembled as his monstrous appetite turned into a slow, rotting death. How could the king who ruled nations lose control to his own hunger? Stay and witness the grotesque diet that destroyed a dynasty. Henry VIII was not born a monster of appetite. In the beginning, his hunger was simply a reflection of his youth. A prince raised in abundance, surrounded by tapestries, marble halls, and endless silver platters meant to display England's wealth to every ambassador who dared to compare courts. But as he grew, that appetite expanded into something far more sinister, something that would shape not only his body, but the fate of his kingdom. His diet became a symbol of power, a performance of dominance, a ritual that fed his authority even as it corrupted him from within. In his early reign, Henry was celebrated for his physical strength. Court poets praised his broad shoulders, his athletic frame, his vigor in jousting and hunting. Foreign envoys described him as almost heroic, the ideal Renaissance prince. Yet beneath that muscular exterior lurked a pattern that would grow out of control. Henry had been conditioned since childhood to eat like a king, and kings, in Tudor logic, were expected to consume enough to remind the world that scarcity belonged only to the weak. Feasting was not a private indulgence for Henry. It was a spectacle, a declaration. Every meal served as a demonstration of supremacy. Mountains of roasted boar, swans glazed in spiced wine, entire tables laden with venison, goose, duck, and beef, arranged like trophies of conquest. Pastries stuffed with dates, figs, and sugared almonds, rivers of ale, cups of claret, sweet puddings thickened with cream. He ate as if the act itself were an extension of monarchy, a ritual reaffirming that England bowed to him. But the shift from indulgence to self-destruction began quietly. After a jousting accident left him in agony for months, Henry's mobility diminished. Pain settled into his leg like a permanent guest, and movement, once the pillar of his identity, became torture. The king who once raced through forests on horseback now struggled to stand without assistance. A man who cannot move must find something else to fill the hours. Henry filled his with food. Meals grew heavier, longer, more elaborate. He demanded dishes richer than before, sauces thicker, portions greater. Servants carried trays so large, took 2 men to balance them. His personal kitchens, already famed for extravagance, became a furnace of non-stop cooking. Spices imported at enormous cost were used by the handful. Pies were sculpted into miniature castles. Meat arrived in quantities that could feed villages. Henry devoured it all. But beneath the glory and display, his body began to revolt. While Henry sat at gilded tables, his leg ulcers widened. The king's weight increased rapidly, pressing on bones that could no longer bear it. The more he ate, the more pain followed, and the more pain followed, the more he ate. It became a cycle, an Ouroboros, the king consuming himself. Meanwhile, the court changed around him. Servants whispered of the growing odor that lingered near the king on humid days, a smell sharp and sour, the scent of infection. Physicians grew more concerned, but Henry trusted none of them fully. Each diagnosis felt like an insult, each warning like treason. He was the king, the body of England. How could a king's body betray him? And yet it did. His cheeks, once flushed with youth, took on a heavy pallor. His breathing grew louder, more labored, even during short conversations. The veins in his neck swelled with each exertion. Some nights, attendants found him wheezing in his sleep, gripping the edge of his mattress as though drowning on dry land. Still, the feasts continued. No one dared suggest restraint. Ministers feared being dismissed or worse. Physicians diluted their warnings. Courtiers flattered him endlessly, praising his royal strength, even as they exchanged terrified glances behind his back. And Henry, desperate to preserve the illusion of control, embraced denial as if it were medicine. But the illusion shattered the day one of his closest servants fainted from lifting a platter too heavily laden for a single man. Henry did not rise to help. He could not. He simply stared, breath heavy, sweat gathering across his brow. The room fell into uncomfortable silence. It was the moment the court began to realize what Henry refused to admit. The king was no longer eating to live. He was eating toward death, and the signs of that death were already carving their way into his flesh. Would England survive a monarch devouring his own throne from the inside out? Or would Henry's appetite consume far more than his body as the years dragged on? As the years progressed, Henry's meals transformed from mere feasts into full-scale rituals of excess. His kitchens operated like a military camp, governed by precise schedules, rotating crews, and an army of cooks whose only duty was to satisfy the king's unstoppable hunger. Fires burned day and night, spits rotated endlessly. Barrels of ale rolled across stone floors. It took hundreds of hands to maintain the illusion that the king still controlled his empire, even as he was losing control of the one thing no monarch could escape, his own body. By this time, Henry's mobility had deteriorated drastically. The leg ulcers that plagued him were no longer minor afflictions, but gaping wounds that refused to heal. Physicians packed them with poultices of honey, resin, and herbs, yet nothing eased the agony. The king carried the smell of decay with him, an odor that clung to his clothes and seeped into the wooden walls of his chambers. Courtiers tried to endure it with straight faces, but more than one collapsed after exiting his presence, overwhelmed by nausea. To cope with the pain, Henry remained seated for most of the day, and as he spent more time at rest, his meals grew larger. He devoured plate after plate, as though filling the emptiness his failing body left behind. Roasted oxen glazed with spices, stews thick with fat, entire pies stuffed with veal, pork, and bone marrow, sugared pastes that stuck to the roof of the mouth. He consumed enough meat in a single day to feed dozens of soldiers. And yet, beneath the layers of silk and velvet, his body was rotting. As his weight increased, so did the strain on his ulcerated leg. The wounds became so deep that attendants could hear the faint squelch when the king shifted his position. Sometimes the bandages soaked through before noon, leaving stains across his stockings so dark and foul that servants burned them outright. Henry pretended not to notice. A king did not acknowledge rot. Still, the court noticed. Their fear grew. Living near Henry became dangerous. The royal apartments were humid, heavy with the scent of meat, sweat, infection, and wine. The temperature rarely felt natural, either too hot from the fires needed to prepare his endless meals, or unbearably cold, as drafts seeped through stone walls. Servants became sick more often. Some fainted during meal service. A few died quietly and without remark, replaced immediately by others too frightened to refuse the position. But the most unsettling change was in Henry's behavior. The king's once sharp mind began to dull beneath the weight of physical suffering. He grew paranoid, convinced that those around him exaggerated his condition to undermine him. He accused ministers of plotting, wives of betrayal, physicians of incompetence. His temper, once grand and theatrical, turned violent. A dropped platter could result in a beating. A poorly cooked roast could trigger a dismissal. A moment of hesitation near his bandaged leg could spark accusations of treason. He was dying, and he knew it, but he refused to let anyone speak of it. One morning, a trembling physician suggested reducing the king's consumption of meat to ease the strain on his organs. Henry's face darkened instantly. His voice thundered across the chamber, vibrating with rage, as he accused the man of sabotaging the monarchy. Guards dragged the poor physician away, and he was never seen in court again. After that, no one dared mention moderation. Instead, the feasts grew larger, more extravagant, more grotesque. Roasted birds served inside larger birds, meat layered upon meat, sugar sculptures taller than a man. Henry demanded constant spectacle, as though terrified that silence might reveal the truth he refused to confront. Meanwhile, his body betrayed him daily. Simple movements became impossible. Attendants had to haul him upright, with pulleys disguised as furniture. Dressing him required several men. At times, Henry screamed when his ulcerated leg was touched, a scream so raw and guttural that it silenced the palace. The sound echoed like a wounded animal trapped in a royal cage. But even when the pain reached unbearable levels, Henry returned to the table. He tore into food with the desperation of a man drowning, mistaking consumption for control. The more his body collapsed, the more aggressively he fed it. Then came the night that changed everything. It was winter, the air slicing cold. Henry demanded a midnight banquet, an entire spread of meats and custards brought to his chamber. Servants carried tray after tray as he watched with hollow eyes. But when the meal arrived, when the roasted swan, the sugared pears, the river of wine were placed in front of him, Henry froze. His hand began to tremble, not with weakness, but with something far worse, fear. For the first time, he hesitated. The court whispered for weeks about that moment. They wondered what he had seen, what he had felt, what dark realization had flickered across his mind as he stared at the food that had both comforted and tortured him for decades. No one knew for certain, because Henry said nothing, but everyone understood that his body had reached a threshold. Something inside him was ready to collapse, something irreversible. And the next feast would bring him one step closer to the death he had eaten his way toward for years. If you're still here, you can stomach more than most royal historians. Subscribe and tell me, do you think Henry feared the food, or feared what it had already turned him into? Henry's hesitation at the midnight feast did not mark a transformation. It marked the beginning of a terrifying decline. The king's body, pushed past every reasonable limit, had begun to break down in ways even his closest attendants struggled to comprehend. His swelling increased. His breathing deepened into a wet, labored rasp. His skin flushed blotchy, then turned pale, then purple in patches. Yet each morning, the ritual continued. Servants brought him mountains of food, and Henry fought to consume enough to convince himself he still ruled something, even if that something was only the space between him and the table. But a king cannot rule his kingdom when he cannot rule his own flesh. Within weeks, Henry's leg ulcers worsened to an extent even his loyal physicians dared not describe aloud. They expanded, deepened, and began to weep constantly. The smell that radiated from them filled every hallway he passed through. Ministers scheduled audiences at a distance, choosing courtyards or open chambers where air could escape more easily. Even then, some fainted. Others vomited discreetly behind columns. No matter how hard Henry tried to hide behind denial, the evidence surrounded him like a fog. His clothing strained against his expanding waistline. His once regal movement became a shuffle. His cries during dressing reached a pitch that startled the guards outside. The king who once charged into battles with roaring confidence now screamed merely from standing. But the worst change came from within. Henry began experiencing crushing chest pains, sudden, violent, as if invisible fingers gripped his heart. His attendants watched helplessly as he gasped for breath, clutching his chest with trembling hands. These episodes grew more frequent, more unpredictable. One struck him while he was signing a decree, another during a small council meeting, a third while he was being lifted into bed by attendants. Each episode stole a piece of him. Yet he refused to change anything, his diet, his schedule, his self-image. To Henry, moderation equaled weakness, and weakness had no place on the throne. Still, the collapse came faster than anyone expected. One evening, after a particularly extravagant meal, roasted lamb soaked in butter, custard sugared to excess, jellied fruits glistening red and gold. Henry demanded wine. A servant poured it. Another lifted the goblet. But just as the cup reached Henry's lips, he slumped forward, his body folding under its own weight. His attendants rushed to catch him before he toppled from the chair. His breathing was shallow, his pupils dilated, his hands twitched violently. They carried him to bed, calling for every physician in the palace. The men arrived breathless, their faces ghostly pale as they observed the king's state. They attempted to rouse him. They shouted his name. They pressed herbs to his nose. Nothing worked. For 3 hours, Henry drifted in and out of consciousness. When he finally woke, he demanded more food. The court fell into quiet panic. His physicians knew these collapses were signs of catastrophic strain, strokes, embolisms, heart failure. But they also knew the truth. They did not have the authority to deny him anything. Not food, not wine, not the illusion of kingship. So the cycle continued. Each day, his appetite diminished in bursts before roaring back with terrifying force. He devoured meals twice as large as those consumed by entire noble families, even as his body trembled with effort. Every bite appeared to cost him something, as though he were bargaining with his own mortality, one forkful at a time. But the king's mind was crumbling. He grew delirious at times, muttering about betrayal, past wives, ghosts of enemies long dead. Sometimes he forgot which wife was alive or which minister he had executed. The line between hunger and hallucination blurred. Servants reported hearing him speak to empty chairs, insisting someone was there. And as his mind deteriorated, the physical transformation became impossible to ignore. His face swelled until his eyes seemed sunken and small. His neck bulged with thick folds. His hands, once strong and elegant, puffed into shapeless masses. His breathing shook the bed. His wounds seeped through fresh bandages within minutes. His legs, barely functional, resembled pillars that could no longer hold their own weight. Still, he demanded food. Still, he devoured. Still, the court watched in terror. Then came the moment that changed everything, the moment his own body rebelled in a way no one could ignore. It happened during what the cooks called the Victory Feast, a celebration Henry insisted upon, despite being too weak to stand. The table overflowed with roasted meats, golden pies, steaming platters, puddings dusted with sugar. Musicians played softly, their eyes downcast. Courtiers forced smiles as they watched the king lift a massive piece of meat to his mouth. Halfway through chewing, Henry froze. His eyes widened. He dropped the meat. His breathing stopped. For a moment, the entire room held its breath, waiting for him to move. He didn't. Attendants rushed forward. Ministers shouted. Musicians stopped mid-note. Physicians elbowed through the panic, surrounding the king as sweat poured down their faces. Henry VIII, the king who ate without restraint, who devoured his way through grief, triumph, rage, and denial, sat motionless, eyes fixed on the table before him. His chest rose only slightly, and when it fell, it did not rise again, at least not at first. When it finally did, the sound that escaped Henry's throat was so grotesquely strained that half the courtiers recoiled in horror. Something inside him had ruptured, and that rupture would mark the start of the king's final descent. You're deep into the decay now. Only the bravest keep watching. Subscribe and tell me, do you think the king's collapse was the beginning of the end, or the moment death finally tasted him? When Henry's chest finally rose again, the court exhaled in collective terror, but the relief was short-lived. The sound that escaped him was not the breath of a recovering man, but the ragged, choking groan of a body collapsing under its own monstrous weight. His attendants rushed to steady him, yet even their combined strength could barely keep him upright. Henry's skin glistened with sweat, his face flushed a deep, dangerous red, and his eyes darted wildly, as if trying to track something only he could see. The king was not simply ill. He was deteriorating from the inside out. The aftermath of the victory feast forced the court to confront a reality they had avoided for years. Henry's body was no longer capable of supporting his appetite. His feasts did not energize him. They drained him, suffocating him under layers of flesh, infection, and exhaustion. He now required hours, sometimes an entire day, to recover from what used to be routine meals. His heart strained so violently after eating that the attendants who stood near him could hear his pulse hammering inside his chest. But the king refused to slow down. He demanded even richer meals, even more elaborate dishes, as if attempting to overpower death through sheer consumption. Cooks worked tirelessly, terrified of disappointing him. They prepared roasts dripping with fat, pies dense with marrow, puddings thickened with cream and sugar. Servants wheeled in massive spreads 3 times a day, and often again at night. Henry, though visibly suffering, devoured what he could and ordered the rest left nearby for later, even when he was too weak to lift a fork. The more he ate, the more violently his body rebelled. His heart episodes grew more frequent, each one lasting longer, leaving him gasping, clutching at his chest as attendants screamed for physicians. They rushed in with trembling hands, offering herbal concoctions, pressing cloths to his temples, praying under their breath. But nothing they did could halt the march of decadence wearing away at him like a slow, merciless tide. Meanwhile, the royal apartments became unbearable. The constant fires burning to heat his food thickened the air until it felt heavy and suffocating. The festering ulcers on his leg produced an odor so pungent that even loyal servants struggled to remain conscious when tending him. The combination of infected flesh and stale feast smoke clung to his chamber walls, saturating the tapestries, creeping into adjoining rooms like a foul ghost. When ambassadors visited, they often covered their noses discreetly, pretending to be overcome by the heat. Some fainted outright. Others later confessed they had never witnessed a monarch in such a terrifying state of physical collapse. The king's mental state worsened just as quickly. Henry grew suspicious of everyone. He accused cooks of poisoning him. He shouted at his physicians for failing to cure him. He berated his attendants for moving too slowly, too quickly, too silently, too loudly. His rage erupted without warning. Ministers learned to approach him only from angles where he could see them coming. Surprising him could trigger a violent outburst. But the most disturbing change was his fear. Late at night, Henry's attendants reported hearing him cry out from nightmares. Sometimes he called the names of wives he had executed. Other times he wept, begging unseen figures not to abandon him. On the worst nights, he whispered to himself between shallow breaths, convinced that death was hiding somewhere in the shadows of his chamber, waiting for the right moment to strike. And yet, despite his terror, he kept eating. The need to consume seemed to grow stronger the weaker he became. His body, starved of function yet drowning in excess, could no longer process what he forced into it. His digestion slowed to a crawl. His swelling worsened. His stools became irregular, then infrequent, then nearly impossible. Each new feast pushed him closer to internal collapse. His organs strained overloaded, suffocating under the weight of his unending gluttony. Still, Henry refused to stop. Then came the incident that shook even the most hardened courtiers. One evening, after consuming an enormous spread of roasted meats and sweetened custards, Henry attempted to rise from his chair. He managed only a few inches before collapsing back down with a thud. His face turned a frightening shade of purple. His mouth gaped open. His hands clawed at the air. Attendants rushed to support him, but their efforts made no difference. Henry was choking, not on food, on his own breath. His lungs struggled to expand beneath the pressure of his massive torso. His airway narrowed. His eyes bulged with panic. His legs kicked weakly. A physician shoved through the crowd, But when he tried to intervene, Henry swatted him away in blind terror. Minutes passed. His body convulsed. His lips darkened. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Henry gasped sharply, sucking in air with a desperate wheeze that echoed through the chamber. The courtiers stepped back, shaken to their core. Some believed he had died and returned. Others whispered that his soul was already half gone. Henry, trembling violently, demanded more wine. That was the night the court realized the king was no longer fighting death. He was dragging it out, stretching it into a grotesque spectacle of suffering. His body was failing piece by piece, and yet he fed the collapse with every meal, every craving, every demand. Something inside Henry had reached its absolute limit, but the final, catastrophic failure had not yet arrived. And when it did, it would strike with a force no feast could postpone. If you're still watching, you're not just curious. You're fearless. Subscribe and answer this. Do you think Henry's final breakdown will come during a feast? Or in the silent hours afterward, when even kings must face themselves? Henry's near suffocation should have ended the feasts. It should have forced the court to intervene, to wrest control of the king's body away from his collapsing instincts. But the opposite happened. Henry interpreted his survival as proof of divine favor. If God had spared him while lesser men died of common ailments, then surely he intended the king to continue living exactly as he pleased. And so, Henry ate harder. He demanded that his cooks prepare the most extravagant meals of his reign, not out of hunger, but out of a manic determination to assert power over the one enemy he could not execute, his own decaying flesh. His chambers filled with dishes that strained the imagination. Pies sculpted into mythical beasts, poultry stuffed inside larger poultry, cream so sweet and dense that attendants struggled to lift the bowls, rivers of red wine that stained the stone floors. Courtiers watched in horrified silence as Henry devoured all he could, pausing only when waves of pain forced him to grip the table and wait for the room to stop spinning. Physicians, once merely anxious, now lived in a constant state of dread. They recorded his symptoms in secret: swollen legs leaking fluid, ulcerations deepening to the bone, heart rhythms erratic and violent, rapid fluctuations in body temperature, episodes of delirium growing more frequent. They debated among themselves whether the king's organs were failing one by one or collapsing all at once. But none dared tell Henry the truth. The king had executed men for far less than suggesting his body was mortal. Meanwhile, the palace itself began to absorb the consequences of his decline. Servants rotated constantly to avoid prolonged exposure to the stench that clung to Henry's chambers. New attendants lasted days before falling sick or fainting. Some swore their vision blurred near the king's bedside. Others described feeling heat radiating from him like a furnace, as if his body were fighting an invisible inferno. And yet, Henry continued. The more his body deteriorated, the more he fixated on food. It became his refuge, his weapon, his lie, his last remaining illusion of control. Meals stretched for hours. He chewed slowly, painfully, often stopping mid-bite to catch his breath, while attendants waited in terrified silence. At times, he seemed to drift in and out of consciousness between mouthfuls, the fog of delirium thickening around him like smoke. Then came the night that changed everything. Henry awoke screaming. Attendants rushed in with torches to find him thrashing violently, clawing at his chest as if trying to tear something loose from inside. His breaths came in rapid, shallow bursts. His eyes bulged with terror. For a moment, no one understood what had triggered the fit, until they saw the remains of the meal he had taken to bed earlier. The platter was empty. Every slice of meat, every custard, every goblet of wine had been consumed. At some point in the night, in a haze of pain, confusion, and compulsive hunger, Henry had devoured the entire feast. And now his body was shutting down. Physicians were summoned urgently. They arrived trembling, carrying herbs and tonics that might as well have been prayers. They attempted to calm his spasms, to steady his heart, to force air into his lungs. Sweat poured down Henry's temples. His face twisted into a grotesque mask of agony. His limbs jerked uncontrollably. The king who once towered over Europe now lay drowning inside his own failing form. Ferdinand-like attendants, strong men trained for battle, struggled to hold Henry down. They whispered desperate pleas. Some cried. Others looked away, unable to face the sight of a king reduced to writhing helplessly in his own bed. When the convulsions finally slowed, Henry lay still for nearly a minute. The court thought he was dead. Then his eyelids snapped open. He gasped violently, drawing in a breath so sharp and desperate that several attendants jumped back in fear. His entire body shuddered as air filled his lungs. His pulse hammered visibly beneath the skin of his neck. He looked around the chamber, wild-eyed, searching for something, or someone only he could perceive. And then, with a trembling hand, he pointed toward the empty platter on the floor. His voice cracked as he whispered, "More." The attendants froze. The physicians exchanged looks of pure horror. Henry VIII had just survived the most catastrophic physical collapse of his life, and his first thought was to continue the feast that had nearly killed him. Something inside him had broken completely. He was no longer a king. He was a prisoner of his appetite, an appetite pushing him to the brink of death, dragging him closer with each passing day. And although no one dared say it aloud, every soul in that room sensed the truth. The final collapse was coming. It would be violent. It would be sudden. And it would be triggered by the very thing Henry worshipped, his last meal. If you're still watching, you're one of the few who can face history at its most grotesque. Subscribe and tell me, do you think Henry's final meal will be planned, or will it consume him by surprise? Henry's demand for more, after his near-fatal convulsions, marked the final unraveling of a king who had once commanded continents. His court now moved like a funeral procession, silent, terrified, and resigned to the reality that they no longer served a monarch, but rather tended to a living catastrophe. Even the palace walls seemed to absorb the dread, their tapestries drooping from the constant humidity, their corridors thick with the smell of sickness and roasted meats. Every day felt like the beginning of an ending that refused to declare itself. In these final weeks, Henry's body no longer resembled that of a human being. His limbs swelled until his joints disappeared beneath layers of distorted flesh. His fingers, once powerful enough to grip a sword, puffed into shapeless stubs. His breathing became a grotesque spectacle of effort, each inhale scraping through his throat, each exhale rattling like loose stones. His chest heaved with the desperation of a drowning man. The infection in his leg deepened until attendants refused to uncover it unless absolutely necessary. One described the sight only as unholy, another fainted on the spot. But even more disturbing than his physical decay was the way Henry seemed to drift between worlds. He spoke to shadows. He argued with ghosts. He summoned wives long dead, then forgot who they were moments later. Some nights he wept openly, cursing the unseen tormentors he believed hovered near his bed. Other nights he laughed, a hollow, feverish cackle that echoed through the palace. His mind had become as unstable as his body, flickering, failing, fading. Still, he demanded food. Meals arrived in smaller quantities now, not because the cooks wished to spare him, but because his body could no longer tolerate the masses of meat and sugar he once consumed. Yet even the reduced portions were enough to trigger new waves of agony. After nearly every meal, attendants found him slumped sideways, chest pounding violently, sweat streaming down his temples. His physicians begged, quietly, fearfully, for him to stop. Henry refused. To refuse consumption, he believed, was to admit defeat. But defeat found him anyway. One cold January morning, Henry attempted to sit upright to eat. The movement triggered a searing pain that shot across his torso with such force that he cried out, a loud animal wail that brought the entire household running. When attendants reached him, they found the king hunched over, clutching his stomach with both hands, his face contorted in a mixture of fury and terror. His pulse hammered wildly beneath the swollen folds of his neck, his breathing hitched in ragged bursts. It took 6 men to lower him onto his pillows. That night, he did not ask for food. The silence terrified the palace even more than his demands. Henry lying still meant Henry losing the last piece of identity he had held on to. For once, he seemed aware of it. When a servant approached to offer broth, Henry waved him away, muttering something about the end being near. His voice had grown thin, brittle, barely more than a breath. The next day, he attempted to speak to his council. The words dissolved on his tongue. His mouth moved, but the sound died in his throat. Ministers leaned in, desperate to catch any hint of his command, but Henry could no longer produce coherent speech. His body had finally betrayed the throne in the most complete way imaginable. It had silenced the king. By evening, the chamber was prepared for death. Candles lined the walls. Priests murmured prayers. Attendants hovered, their faces pale with fear. Henry drifted in and out of consciousness, each breath weaker than the last. His swollen hands clawed at the sheets, as though searching for something he could no longer reach. His eyelids fluttered. His chest rose in shallow, uneven waves. Then, without warning, Henry's eyes snapped open. He stared at the ceiling, or beyond it, with an expression so haunted that several attendants stepped back in fright. His lips parted. A faint, trembling whisper escaped. More. Bring more. No one moved. No one spoke. The chamber froze in horrified silence as Henry VIII, the king who devoured nations, marriages, and ultimately himself, begged for one final indulgence his body was incapable of accepting. His chest lifted once more. A thin rattle slipped from his throat. And then the rise never came again. Henry VIII died not in battle, not in triumph, not surrounded by glory, but suffocated by the very excess he believed made him invincible. His death was not dramatic, but slow, swollen, and strangled beneath the weight of years of indulgence. A king undone, not by war or rebellion, but by appetite, a grotesque, relentless hunger that consumed him long before the grave ever could. In the end, Henry's legacy became a warning carved into history itself. No empire, no crown, no throne is powerful enough to save a man from the death he feeds with his own hands.